Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. I'm very pleased to be joined by Drew Meloan. Drew is the offering manager for the emerging fuels sector at Honeywell UOP. Obviously, a very well-known name in the petrochemical industry and indeed actually the biofuels industry. So Andrew is going to be speaking at the World Hydrogen Week, particularly on the derivatives side, looking at the CO2 to SAF opportunities that are opening up across the world. So welcome, Andrew. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you're obviously, at the coalface, as it were, in terms of all this emerging technology, new projects and opportunities being pulled up, I guess, from the hydrogen molecule and around it. We're seeing, first legislation, I guess, around e-fuels. We're seeing a lot of interest in ammonia and hydrogen as a building block for other derivatives, such as methanol as well. So maybe just give us some of your own sort of quick background and understanding of Honeywell and what you're seeing in the marketplace.
Sure. So here at Honeywell and specifically at UOP, we've been sort of at the forefront of renewable fuels production. Right now, we offer pathways to upgrade HEFA into sustainable aviation fuel and into renewable diesel. But there's sort of a recognition in the marketplace that renewable fuels demand is going to outpace what we can achieve with fats, oils, and greases. And we're going to need to branch out into different feedstocks in order to meet that global demand. And that means technology pathways from each of those new feedstocks. And common feedstocks that get trotted out are...
Is that one you're looking at?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, sorry, I think I just lost you there. We can just rephrase. I'll just rephrase that last question. Did you lose me?
No, I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And in terms of what are some of those molecules that you're looking at?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of different molecules that you can upgrade into renewable fuels, but some of the most interesting pathways that are coming to light today, our latest technologies are focused on turning CO2 all the way into renewable fuels. So these e-fuels, which can be made from captured CO2 and green hydrogen. We think that a really interesting pathway is to take your renewable electrons in the forms of green hydrogen, combine it with captured CO2 and make that into methanol. Mm-hmm. And that methanol intermediate is then really useful for upgrading into hydrocarbon fuels, especially sustainable aviation fuel.
Yeah. Now, the obvious question is around that CO2 and where's it coming from? And I know we spoke earlier, and you made a very valid point around the fact that there's lots of CO2 being, I guess, released into the atmosphere. So maybe it's a little bit more cost effective at the initial stage of this industry to take the CO2 from the source as opposed to from the atmosphere. Is that how you see it in terms of the current cost of acquiring CO2, if it were?
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about different kinds of CO2 and what is and is not useful for upgrading from a environmental perspective.
Yeah.
Biogenic CO2 from processes like ethanol synthesis, I think there's a general consensus that using that kind of CO2 is good because you're taking plant matter and putting it back into the carbon cycle. And there's a lot of discussion of direct air capture. So installing CO2 capture right out in the, sort of in the middle of nowhere, as it were. But that's the most costly and probably the most difficult way to capture CO2. And if you have otherwise unavoidable industrial emissions right down the street, I think it makes a lot of sense to take a hard look at capturing that CO2 before it makes it out into the air and doing something with it there instead of just waiting for it to dilute down to parts per million and capturing it down the street. And there's a lot of debate in the policy space about exactly how we're going to quantify the life cycle emissions of these different CO2 sources.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, DAC is obviously valid, but it's literally just beginning, and it's probably got another sort of good 10 years in terms of maturation to get to a point where maybe it can then be a valid input into other industries and the decarbonization. In terms of the other approaches or the other work you're doing, or rather the market itself. Obviously, the market is based around regulation initially. We're seeing regulation coming out of here in Europe, and we're seeing obviously potential pathways in the US and other markets. What is your take around that regulation, and what are the more interesting markets, and what are the players that are coming into this market, and what are the types of people that we're going to see producing sustainable jet fuel in the future?
Yeah, well, absolutely. This market is growing. So when you take a look at renewable fuel regulation, there's been an absolute explosion of renewable fuels incentive poured into the market globally over the last 10 years. And the EU and the US are sort of leading the way in this space. So we are seeing a couple of different kinds of regulation, whether it be incentives or mandates to drive disincentives to use high carbon intensity fuels. Regardless, there's in both the EU and the US a lot of funding available to fund these projects and sort of incentivize folks to look at renewable fuels in that way. And ESAF specifically is regulated in the EU with really aggressive targets. So in order to meet the US target in the US SAF Grand Challenge, and in order to meet the EU mandated targets for SAF, as well as the ESAF specific targets, we as a society are going to need to find a way to generate enough hydrogen to capture enough CO2 and to convert that into jet. I'm seeing a lot of interest today from a variety of players in this space, whether it be traditional refiners who have the know-how to handle hydrocarbons, and also some of the petrochemical steps that might be involved, to consortia of governments and refiners and project developers who are all working together to tackle this big problem with whatever resources they have, to just project developers looking to move into the energy transition space and leverage some of their capital there and help the world. And then we also see some interest from power companies, which took me a little by surprise. And I think the interest there falls into two broad categories, whether it be power companies that have access to renewable power that they can turn into hydrogen, or power companies that are making a lot of CO2 as they generate power and see a home for that CO2.
Yeah, that's a fascinating take on the market, seeing that sort of, I guess, convergence of different players who are going to potentially be competing against each other in this kind of fast-growing, sustainable aviation fuels market. And yeah, it makes a lot of sense if you think about some of the power companies, as you say, they've got CO2 on one hand, and also potentially want to be looking at developing more value-add products, which clearly this is going to be one of them. It's been fascinating to chat to you and get your take on the market, Andrew. Looking forward to your contribution at the World Hydrogen Week and particularly the Derivatives Congress, which is happening the first 2 days. So it's 9th to 13th of October, taking place in Rotterdam. Thanks a lot to Honeywell for your support. And as I said, we look forward to meeting you face to face and unpicking this area in greater detail in the coming in October and this fall. So many thanks, Andrew.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Cheers. Take care. Bye-bye.